Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And a couple of times during the program, I noted today is April 15th, and we needed to note that.
Tax day.
Not just because of taxes, but also because of a world tragedy, as you put it.
The fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. I've been a couple of times, David. It's one of the world's great buildings.
And you said Jefferson probably walked by there hundreds of
times.
Any writings that he
mentions it now and then, but he doesn't. He's not a big cathedral guy. He thinks a cathedral was a mistake of human enterprise, but we don't have to agree with that. There are great cathedrals. I've been to, I suppose, 20 in the course of my life. Notre Dame is one of them. Not only that, but it's almost the cultural center of France. France is a highly secular culture. Napoleon saw to that. And France is not any longer a very serious spiritual culture, but Notre Dame is one of their treasures. It's a world treasure. And to see it burning, it's this simple, David. You think in our time that could never happen. You actually think no great building could burn any longer because of the advanced fire retardants that we use.
Of course, we don't know, but we know that there was some kind of renovation going on there. Perhaps that was part of the renovation. Perhaps that's how it started.
We'll learn more in the next...
But a lot of it evidently is wood, and that's all.
Well, that's the thing. So if you've been in one of these cathedrals, they're built of stone. That stone, if it gets hot enough, will calcine, will crumble. Right. That's my fear. But even without that, there are these vaulted ceilings. There's an enormous amount of woodwork in a cathedral, some of it holding up the ceiling, but a lot of it on interior walls and, of course, the pews and altars and so on and so forth. Then you think of the priceless works of art, stained glass windows.
And we can hope that a lot of that wasn't
relics.
Yeah.
I've been to France many times. I'm leading a group to France this fall. No people that I know of has greater pride in its culture, with a capital C, than the French. I mean, this for them is...
This will be a point on which the populace rallies around.
There'll be a rally, and UNESCO has already said it will help save it and rebuild, and other institutions will do so. There will be an outpouring of expertise and financial grants, and I know they'll rebuild it. I know that they will rebuild Notre Dame, and they will. When I was in Oxford, they rebuilt Magdalen Tower, which is just this little 3-story stone tower. It's been there since the 16th century. They numbered every stone and pulled it out because it was irregularly done, and then each stone was handcrafted to be identical to the one that it was replacing. In other words, you could have pulled it down and built something else. That's what we would have done in Minneapolis, Minnesota. You could have pulled it down and built the identical tower, but using computer-created stone and made it much more regular. That's not what they did. They recreated all of the irregularities in every stone in that tower. Cost zillions because of that, but they were not going to rebuild it by throwing up a perfect Lego building. They were going to rebuild it by recapping exactly the idiosyncrasies of every part of that building. That's what they're going to do with Notre Dame. I know a little bit about this because when I was doing some work at Mount Rushmore a number of years ago, they had these crews come in that were taking 3D photographs of Mount Rushmore, and they were taking like hundreds of thousands of photographs with these cameras that were placed in strategic places so they could triangulate. And then all of those images, it's like when you get a root canal or something, all those images went in to a massive computer system. And so let's just say that an earthquake occurred or a terrorist act and Mount Rushmore were destroyed. You could rebuild it down to the micromillimeter because they had every possible dimension. And you know that that's happened to Notre Dame, that they have photographed it from every angle at the highest possible resolution, that they know exactly where every stone was, where every piece of wood was, where every buttress or irregularity was. And now the question will be, how soon can you clear it? And then how do you generate the moment when you rebuild this thing? In a certain sense, it'll never be the same, of course. But we live in a time when you actually can rebuild Notre Dame perfectly if you want to.
I've always had a 3D thing. I've always wondered why someone hasn't done that with the plaster cast of Jefferson.
The life mask.
Yeah. And that exists somewhere, doesn't it?
I believe so. And so you could recreate his face, just as they have recreated Richard III from his bones that were found in a parking lot in New York.
We should get to the show.
But wait, as to the pastor class, just to tell that story quickly. So Jefferson didn't like this kind of thing anyway. The guy comes, Jefferson's elderly. He lies down on his back on a kind of a sofa, and they put plaster on his face. First they put a Vaseline kind of a thing, then they put plaster on his face, and there's a breathing tube.
To do a life mask.
And then they're going to pull that mask, and then they've got it. So, but unfortunately, something went wrong in the application of the chemistry, and they couldn't get the mask off. And Jefferson is panicking, as I would too, and beginning to have trouble breathing. And so they had to use a hammer and a chisel to chisel this mask off of Jefferson's head.
But it exists.
I believe it does.
So why are we not getting a 3D scan of that, you would think?
These things cost money.
We need to get to the show, but this week we had a couple of really fun conversations. We talked with Pat Brodowski, the head gardener at Monticello,
Wright,
a frequent contributor, as you said, to the show, and also Mr. Beau Wright, you have coined the young idealist.
The young idealist.
Right, who is a city council member, I believe,
Yeah,
in
he
Lynchburg.
chafed a little when I said he should get in the arena. He said, hey, buddy, I'm in the arena.
There, yeah.
I'm running.
Always fun to talk to those two. And so with that,
Pat's politics are uncertain.
Conversations.
Beau is a Democrat.
Oh, Pat's politics aren't uncertain.
What are they?
She cares about the gardens. That's her politics. That's a good politics.
She wants to grow things.
Yeah.
And so isn't it time for you to lower the timbre of your voice?
You did it so well a couple of weeks ago.
If you like this program.
Yeah, you were just take it, man.
If you are an admirer of the civility of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
JeffersonHour.com.
If you can help us with money or your expertise or your insights, or send us letters or tell everyone you know, spread the good news on social media. But if you can help us in the Thomas Jefferson Hour, we so deeply appreciate it. We take no money for this program. All of the funds are used to promulgate the Enlightenment. And if we had more funds, we'd promulgate into wider circles of this country.
All right, I think you've done enough.
Well, I'm just doing what you asked.
All right, let's go to the show.
Send gifts to Clay. Forget the rest.
Thank you. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. This week, we're going to make some calls. Seated across from me is the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good to see you, sir.
I just saw Pat Brodowski in the Outer Banks of North Carolina about, 2 weeks ago now. She brought some produce from the gardens for a dinner we held at a place called Coastal Provisions, which is run by a wonderful friend of mine named Danielle Lewis. And Pat was there. She brought me a shirt. We'll talk about it when we call her. But she's been making me this linen shirt.
Really?
For a couple, hand sewing it, because she saw me do Jefferson somewhere, and she said, that Oxford cloth button-down shirt would not pass muster in Jefferson's time.
That's great.
The shirt's about 4 yards long, so it's a night shirt, and it'll be my funeral shroud in addition to everything else. But I thought we'd give her a call today because it's gardening season.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk to her, but I will bet that she will, how do we say, rub in our faces how far along she is.
Oh, yeah, so...
We should say that we're recording this on the 15th of April.
On tax day.
Yeah.
And let's call Beau Wright, because Beau Wright, I think you got a letter from Beau about this program.
He was responding to one of your fine essays and referred to it as spot on, but we haven't talked to Beau in a long time. So
that was my blue and the red essay. So let's give him a call. He's young, he's fun, he has a great sense of humor, he likes to play with us, and he always has good insights.
He visited us here.
He came to visit.
And speaking of shirts, he gave me one.
Yeah, you had to bring it up.
Yeah,
all right,
I'm wearing it.
So let's call Pat. Pat Brodowski, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, our friend from Monticello. I just saw you a couple of weeks ago in the Outer Banks, and I was telling David before we put in this call that while we were there, you gave me my shirt. Describe the shirt.
This has been a dream and a labor and of great happiness. So it's a shirt from a pattern from the 1760s, a French pattern in which you fold the fabric in half and use those seams as the edges of the shirt, and then you add lengths of the fabric for the sleeves and then attach sleeves. And way back in 1760, apparently they didn't think about how the body is a round object. And so putting the neck hole into this shirt was just such a trial. It took me
Took you years.
Well, the shirt was like 2 years of off and on.
What's it made of?
It's linen.
It's beautiful linen, white linen. It's long, so you told me I could cut it down or tuck it in.
Yeah,
Or
what they would do is like use it as a nightshirt and then tuck it in the pants during the day. And it's all hand stitched with cotton thread.
And I was telling you, all hand stitched. It's lovely. I was telling David that its origin was in part that you objected to my wearing Oxford cloth shirts under my Jefferson costume.
Yes.
And so you said you got to be authentic if you're going to do this kind of work, bub.
Right. And how more authentic than have a hand stitched shirt?
Absolutely. I will put a photograph of it online.
Everybody knows who you are if they listen to the Jefferson Hour, Pat. But on the outside chance, it's a new listener. Can you tell us where you're calling from and what your title is and what you do?
Yes. Well, I'm the vegetable gardener at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. So I take care of a garden that is approximately 2 acres or 1,000 feet long, and it's of all the vegetables and herbs that Jefferson grew during his lifetime. And right now I'm sitting, I'm actually on the orchard stairs because it's a little out of the wind. We've got a nice breeze today, and so it's a quieter spot to be. But I just finished planting strawberries. I have alpine strawberries going in to replace the ones that are missing, and we planted 72 tomato plants today outside.
Oh my! You know, it's always hard to talk to you because of the difference in weather. I will tell you, however, that I have 6 very healthy Brad's Atomic Grape tomato plants. You sent some seeds last year. It was a little late to get them started, but they popped right up this year.
Oh, good.
You're seated at the garden.
Yes.
Tell us what you see as you look left and right.
Well, we have just passed all the fruit trees in bloom. So now it's redbuds and dogwoods. And you can just about see the leaves unfurling every day when you're sitting here. All the fruit trees are now all in leaf. The tulips have been spectacular. The linden leaves are out. The stalk of asparagus came up today. We're harvesting radishes. Really, everything is just exploding. The whole symphony of colors and plants. It's just great.
How many human beings do you see in the garden?
Oh, they're in little groups, little family groups. So there's a tour at the Hemmings cottage of about 50. There's some people kind of like moving around through the vegetables, like maybe another 20 people. It's spacious enough so that you never feel crowded.
When I come to Monticello, which I do a couple of times per year, I always go out into the gardens and I walk down to the graveyard and I sit out along the fish ponds and enjoy the flowers and, of course, take the tour and so on and so forth. And I think about you. Are there ever any days when you're out there and you just think, oh my goodness, I'm the gardener at Monticello? I mean, there can't be a better gig in the universe for a gardener than to be the gardener at the home of America's greatest gardener.
It is. It's such a gift. Every day you come up into the garden. We ascend from the second roundabout. We come up into the garden, and that view it unfolds in front of you. Whether it's misty and it looks like islands or the ocean, or like right now it's all like green layers of green leaves and blue horizon, and just it's breathtaking. And then everything that you want to grow will grow spectacularly on this terrace.
So we not to be selfish about this at all, but I think you've told me in our many encounters that now that we have made a big deal out of the gardens and you've become a regular correspondent, that few weeks go by when someone doesn't turn up saying, "Hey, are you the famous Pat Brodowski?"
This is so true. And I always ask if they have heard the Thomas Jefferson Hour, and you'd be surprised how many people come to the garden because they've heard the show and they want to meet the gardener or talk gardens, and so we're starting a collection of photographs of these people who arrive. It's really pretty fun.
We want to see them.
The Garden Club.
A year or so ago, you sent Clay and I both some hand-carved dibbles, and I want you to know that yesterday I went out and I used mine and I planted my spinach seeds. Which
tell us, Pat, what a dibble is.
Tell us what a dibble is. Yeah.
Yeah. So the dibble is a pointed stick, basically, but it's a fat stick, And I've got a whole collection of them. Some people made them out of like old tool handles, and they just carved to a point, kind of like a monster pencil. And then I've got some that are like cast iron or forged or whatever. And the different sizes are good for different things. So I've got one that's got measurements on it, so you know how far in you're plunging. I've seen dibble sticks that have a little stick you can attach to the side so that you don't go in too far. But you just make this really beautiful hole, and that you know how deep it is. And then when you're putting in your little seedling, that taproot is going to go to the bottom of the hole.
I have to tell you that I treasure mine, and I wanted you to know that I used it yesterday for the first time.
Get that dirty. Get it dirty.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, you talked about all of the visitors that come, and how special it is to be where you are and do what you do. What kind of things should visitors know about that are coming up at Monticello this summer?
Well, Garden Week in Virginia is coming up in late April, and there's some special tours. We have on Memorial Day weekend and Easter weekend, we have extra activities like for children, because we have a lot of visitors from out of town, and a lot of kids want to just have something special. So we have a scavenger hunt, and I think they have games, and a number of archaeology, I think, has displays and things you can peruse the artifacts. So there's a lot of extra things on Memorial Day weekend. And then in the summer, we have different kinds of tastings of fruit and other things. If you look at the website under Saturdays in the Garden, it lists a whole number of events. There's special talks called Tom Talks. There's open houses at the Center for Historic Plants. There's archaeology walks. There's just a steady stream of really interesting things to do. So I would suggest that you just look at the website and really hammer through it and see about things that you'd really like to do.
So, Pat, I have to remind our listeners that one of the greatest days of my whole life was when we were at Monticello, about 6 or 7 of us, a couple of years ago now, and we went to the garden, and you let us plant lettuce with your little thimbles, and so each one of us got to plant a little row of lettuce, and then this was a little bit like Tom Sawyer. I think you let us do your work, but that's neither here nor there. But then you were then gathering a gourd here and a cucumber there and a melon and a tomato and so on. And almost effortlessly, we would then walk down to this little area where there's a table, picnic table, and then you made us this salad. And we ate absolutely fresh vegetables from the garden of Thomas Jefferson at your hands. That for me was like the purpose of being alive and being a Jeffersonian, was to have that moment. You were so generous to us. I just think of what it must mean for you to be not only carrying on this tradition that was largely begun by Peter Hatch of restoring the gardens, but also hearkening back to historic seeds and heritage seeds and trying to do this original research to get as close as it can possibly be now to get to Jefferson's own garden and gardening practices. That's got to be quite a life quest for you.
Yeah, I really started years ago looking at historic vegetables and herbs and recipes, because I really wanted to know what it was that people were tasting and eating and enjoying, because I thought it had to be better than what we have today.
We should let you get back to the work that's so important, the work that you do, but it's just always great to talk to you, Pat.
Let's talk again in a few weeks. But the next time we call you, we will have actually planted something in our gardens, and we'll see if it comes up. We're talking with Pat Brodowski, the gardener at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, our good friend, a frequent contributor to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll talk to you again soon, Pat. God bless you.
Okay, thank you very much for talking. It's been a wonderful day.
Always great to talk to Pat.
She's such a cheerful, intelligent.
And she made you a shirt.
You should see this shirt.
I want to see this shirt.
I'll send a photograph of it.
Yeah.
But she is so much fun to be around.
We need to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to continue our calling and talk to Mr. Beau Wright.
Our friend Beau Wright of Lynchburg, not so far from Monticello.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And next up is
our friend Beau from rural Virginia.
Mr. Beau Wright.
A frequent contributor to this program, formerly a key aide to the 44th President of the United States, Mr. Barack Obama. He joins us, I think, from Lynchburg. Is that where you are today?
Yes, hello.
And it just seems like yesterday that you were you're one of the few people who made the trek to North Dakota.
We love those visitors who actually come here in search of the barn.
And I think even more than that, I enjoyed the dinner that evening.
Sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, it
Apparently
was
a T-shirt was in the offing. But
it was.
Yeah. We're calling you today because you sent in an email to us after a program a week or two ago in which I had written something about the sort of cold civil war that we find ourselves in. And, the Mueller report has come. We won't talk about that today. But I wanted to get your perspective on why you wrote that note. Where do you see, leaving Trump out of this, assuming that Donald Trump is a symptom rather than a cause of the current political situation in the United States, where do you think we are? And how did we get here, and where do you think we're heading? And how about that for a simple question?
Yeah, that's a big one. So I thought your essay captured incredibly well the current divide in our nation's politics, and I worry a great deal, as I think you do, about the sort of existential threat to our democracy posed, really, just by our inability to talk to and understand each other, and our inability to have empathy for the perspective of others. Recent polls have come out that suggest that huge swaths of both political parties view the people in the other party not just as people who are wrong on policy, but who are evil, who are bad people, who are malicious in intent. And I think that's really dangerous to not just to the fabric of society, but to the future of our democracy. And so I think that's where we are right now. I don't want to downplay the division in our country, but I am hopeful because I think, if you look at generations that are the Gen Zers and the millennials, that those generations are much more focused on community and much more focused, I think, on political unity than our predecessors. So I'm hopeful that we're heading in the right direction.
The question that I have been puzzling over myself for a couple of years, and I think it's like studying quantum mechanics. I think that I almost understand it, and then I slip back, and then I go through periods of great frustration, and I try a different way to understand it. But here's the question, and I know you've been thinking about it. Why is the country so stirred up and angry and vindictive? Why is there so much rancor and so much not just distrust but hatred, and not just from the right, from the left at times too? What caused us to get this on edge as a people? Because if you look around and from a certain point of view, we've never had it so good.
Yeah. I mean, it's a complex question, isn't it?
That's why you're on the show.
Well,
that's why we called you.
Let me offer a two-word answer.
All right.
Social media. It's a phenomena that we kind of forget about that is unique to the generation that we live in. You talked about younger people and you weren't quite so worried about them. I think they have a better handle on this. But I think social media has allowed people to behave badly without responsibility and to exacerbate arguments that otherwise might have been talked out. I really think that's the case.
I think that's right. And, I'd probably take it back further to this dissolution or the devaluation of the big three news networks and the proliferation of cable news, which is now, setting aside a few outlets, pretty partisan. And so I think most of us live in our own realities. We live in our own political bubbles. And there's very little crossover, which is, I think, and forgive me for plugging the Jefferson Hour, but I think that's what makes the Jefferson Hour special, is that it is one of those few cross-cutting programs that does appeal to people on both sides of the aisle because it speaks to our rational mind.
You know, the other thing that really strikes me is how quickly citizens during our time diminish the value of government. I mean, I can remember it going back to the days of Goldwater, and, you know, government is so bad. Clay, I'm sure, has a much broader historical perspective on that than I do, but it's kind of like saying, well, my children are no good. The government is our child. We fathered it, we mothered it, and we made it what it is. We need to be able to discipline it and make it better if the need be.
Of the people, by the people, for the people.
Well, now you're channeling your inner Lincoln. So tell us about the work that your foundation is doing, your entity, to address this.
I work for a group called Protect Democracy, and we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy organization. And we're working on a number of things, right? So our goal is not to advance any kind of partisan interest. Our goal is to protect small d democracy here at home. And we view this as being a project really in three stages. The first stage is just holding up the house. It's just keeping the house from burning down, just trying to call out these authoritarian abuses and stop them, oftentimes in the courts where we can.
Let me just stop you there. So number one, keep the house from burning down. Is it possible that the house will burn down?
I think our institutions have proven to be more resilient than we thought. But I definitely think that there is huge risk if citizens aren't vigilant in protecting our democratic norms and institutions.
Okay, Beau, so keep the house from burning down. That was number one of three. What's the second one?
Second stage is, we call it our roadmap for renewal, but it's passing a series of Watergate-style reforms meant to do things, like strengthen oversight of the executive branch, constrain abuses of executive power, protect the courts, protect inclusive and fact-based democratic dissent, and modernize our campaigns by making sure that when you go to vote, that your vote is going to be counted, and there's not going to be any kind of funny business in the execution of the election. So that's stage two.
All right, so let me stop you at stage two. So after Watergate, I've just been watching this really outstanding documentary on CNN called Tricky Dick. It was really a magnificent piece of work, 4 hours. And really, I think everyone who's interested in the Jefferson Hour should watch that splendid documentary. But after the ordeal of Watergate, a lot of reform legislation was passed, and some of it actually worked. It's breaking down now, perhaps. But do you think that whatever happens, whether President Trump wins a second term, whether he finishes this term, whether he doesn't finish this term, there will be a post-Trump moment at some point in this country, and presumably whatever the hypnosis is, the cult of President Trump will dissipate. When that happens, do you expect to see some of that reform legislation pass so that we can protect cabinet agencies better and we can protect the judiciary from these sort of assaults and so on? Do you think that this package you're talking about in number two of your list of three will actually find its way into legislation?
Yes, I think so. I want to obviously be cognizant of the partisan realities on Capitol Hill and in state houses across the country. But what we're talking about here aren't partisan issues. We're talking about basic American values and fundamental American institutions. And I think that there's a lot of cross-partisan appeal here that a lot of folks can get behind. And I'd welcome folks to visit our website, because we often partner, not just with groups on the left, but groups on the right who also care about these issues, because these are sort of bedrock principles that we think we're defending.
Right. So let me interrupt you. First, give us the website.
Sure. protectdemocracy.org.
I want to bolster your point, if I can, or certainly to agree with it. Let's just put it this way. Let's say that that Bernie Sanders is the next president of the United States. Surely the very people that are protecting the current administration would jump on the bandwagon of your reforms the moment he were elected. In other words, you're saying it's nonpartisan, and you're right, that the people that have, for whatever reason, decided that they really admire President Trump, if they could pull back from that and the next person is a Democrat, they would want those very protections against overreach from the executive that they're now permitting because of whatever hold President Trump has on their larger admiration.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And I think you've seen that a number of members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, are deeply uncomfortable with some of the precedents now that President Trump is setting, because they realize that if the Democrats in that position, there's the whole, emergency situation on the border. The president's declaring a national emergency to build a border wall and circumvent Congress's control of funds. And I think that obviously makes a number of conservatives, rightly, and liberals very uncomfortable, because the president, this is the presidential abuse of power.
Before I ask you about number 3, I just want to make this statement. It'll perhaps sound nutty, but I wish there were a little tiny 1-volt shock that would touch our neck every time one of us, you, I, David, or anyone, said something that we would flip on if the other party were in power. In other words, if you say of President Trump, I certainly can't stand his executive orders, you should get this little shock, because did you feel the same way when President Clinton was in power? Did you feel the same way when Barack Obama was in power? In other words, every time we say something that is essentially hypocritical, because it really is based in partisanship rather than in civics, it would be nice if we got a teeny tiny little reminder shock that said, 4 years from now, you're going to be a little bit embarrassed when this comes back to haunt you.
Well, I'd happily put that on.
You'd put on the little collar?
Yeah. You can shock me, but
I'll do it.
I don't think President Jefferson would approve of such a government program. I must interject.
I think it's a great idea. All right, give us number 3. So number 1 was keep the house from burning down. Number 2 is a raft of reform proposals that you regard as nonpartisan and would be for the good of the separation of powers doctrine and good for the Constitution. What's number 3?
And then number 3 is, the long-term rebirth and rededication to liberal democracy. And, of course, I'm saying liberal with small l, right? Liberal,
not leftist progressive, but
that's
liberal
right.
Meaning rule of law, due process, traditional forms.
Well, knowing
right.
you, Beau, there's probably just a little bit of that capital L there.
Hey, Dave, hey.
Keep your capital L to yourself. All right, but go ahead.
That's
What
Yeah.
liberal democracy are you talking about?
I think our classical sense of this country, and look, 40% of Americans in recent polls say they have lost faith in democracy as a form of government. And I happen to believe that democracy is the best form of government. And so I'm not going to try to articulate exactly what we think should happen, because this is a mammoth question that's going to, I think, require a lot of deep thought and collaboration across the country to solve. But I think that's sort of stage 3. It's out there. We know it's coming beyond the sort of immediate political moment. But I think we need to be having a deep conversation about what we want our democracy to look like 50 years, 100 years down the road.
So if you were at CPAC today giving a talk before 2,500 conservative people,
sure,
and you outlined the 3 pieces of agenda that you just have, you would hope that all of the people in that room would listen carefully and would think that you make some good points, and that the best argument that they could make was the system is so broken that we needed a large disruptor, and so it's healthy in some sense for the country for him to shake our system to its roots. Do you feel that argument can be made?
I would welcome that interpretation that we can at least use this moment where the country is highly divided to restore faith in our democracy, to restore faith in our government.
Well said.
Thank you. So that's what I hope happens.
So you're a lonely man living in this country where only 8 people actually agree with this sort of idealism. So do you feel your movement is growing?
You should know, Beau, that he put your number in his phone, and instead of Beau Wright, he put Beau, young idealist.
Oh, really?
Well, once I get my T-shirt, I'll be fixing that. But really, I mean, do you feel that your movement is growing? In other words, I would hope that I would think that almost everyone in the 80% that's the center of this country would in some sense agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I definitely think, if you're following, most forms of media right now, the conversation about the state of our democracy, especially in the lead up to the 2020 presidential election, I think is you're seeing that as an issue of national concern, it's getting a lot of attention. And I think that's because people recognize that something's really wrong here, and we got to pay attention to it.
So now, Beau, when you see all these people running for president now, some of whom are even younger than you are, do you hearken to Theodore Roosevelt's demand that you get into the arena? Why aren't you running for president?
Well, hold on a second. I kind of got into the arena, and
that's right.
I get to represent my community here on city council, and that's about the biggest job I can imagine. And I love it.
That's a good transition point. You have served your city, and so here, tell us about what's going on in Lynchburg.
Well, thank you very much for asking. We are in the midst of planning our fiscal year 2020 budget, and so we're having a lot of conversations in our community about what we value, because I think you really read a community's or a company's priorities through their budget. But Lynchburg is experiencing a real rebirth, I think is a fair way to put it. We're moving up a level, and these are pretty heady and exciting times for us.
Well, I remember well your invitation to visit there, and I would like to see Lynchburg, and I would like to see Poplar Forest. So,
well, there's my
hope
thought,
is not
David,
lost.
And Beau, here's what I'm thinking. You're in the budget process. How about you budget for the Jefferson Hour to originate from City Hall one of these days, that we come there and we meet with you and give some lectures and we gather some people and talk about this very set of questions.
You don't have to respond to that, Beau. It'll be fine.
I think this is the perfect thing. I mean, that we could have dinner at Poplar Forest. We could go into the den of the lion itself. We could do this at Liberty University.
And I know you have some very important meetings you need to get to, Beau. So with that,
I'm serious, sir. There certainly is a slush fund in there somewhere.
We operate a very lean budget here in Lynchburg, but you all are most welcome anytime.
We will make that journey.
Great to talk to you, Beau. Let's keep in touch.
Thanks, guys. Take care now.
It is always such a pleasure to talk to Beau Wright.
His website, protectdemocracy.org, nonpartisan.
We'll get a link up on our website.
Protectdemocracy.org. He has such hope for this country, and he says, I think that younger people are less stirred up and kind of nutty right now than older Americans.
I do think that has something to do with social media and how they accept it as opposed to people, say, of your and my generation.
Well, I'm getting me one of them smartphones. I know that.
Again, we've been talking with Beau Wright from Lynchburg, Virginia. And, it's always such a joy to talk to him. His insight is terrific, but his optimism is absolutely infectious. Thanks again, Beau. It is time for us to take a short break. Again, we're recording this program on April 15th, 2019, and my goodness, there's just been a devastating loss in Paris that we need to talk about a bit. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We're recording this on Monday, April 15th, 2019. And David, as we began to record the program on Tax Day, I got a notice that Notre Dame in Paris was on fire. I assumed that this would be a relatively small matter. We've turned on a television monitor here in the studio. We're in the studio today. And it looks like it might be a total loss. It's certainly a devastating fire at one of the world's most important buildings and the center of the Catholic Church in France. Notre Dame is burning.
You've been there
I have,
at least a couple times.
Right.
For people who haven't been there, what can you tell us about it?
It's a magnificent medieval cathedral. It's not only one of the centers of Christianity in the heart of Europe, built between the 12th and the 14th century, but it's also sort of ground zero in France. So distances are measured from Notre Dame to Lyon, or Notre Dame to Aix-en-Provence, or Marseille, or Bordeaux. France is a very secular country now, but it's one of the cultural centers of Europe. It's simply one of the 5 or 6 most beautiful buildings in the world.
And it's centuries old, so Jefferson would have seen it.
Of course he saw it. It was one of the most significant landmarks in Paris in his time because it's massive. And he was there many, many times. He walked by it probably 200 times in the course of his 5 years in France. He went into it many times. He was not a big fan of cathedrals, but you can't help but be amazed. And here's something that I think it's really important to know. In the Catholic Church, there are relics, bits of the cross, a thorn from the crown of thorns, pieces of cloth that date to St. Francis or to people even farther into the history of the church. And Notre Dame has one of the world's most important collections of relics. I hope, and I suppose pray, that they have been saved from this fire. We're looking at it as we sit here. It's a conflagration. It looks like it could be a total loss. I'd be surprised if
it's spread
if
out.
Walls
isn't
don't.
It? Yeah.
It is spread out, but I think that maybe that stone walls may collapse here too. They'll calcine. This it's hard to know what to compare this to. The Great Fire of London in the 1660s.
On it too much because we really don't know anything at this point. We
don't know what caused it,
but it seems as if there was some sort of project of
a renovation project.
Yeah, so perhaps a lot of the interior stuff had been moved, or we can only hope.
Well, we'll know more, and we don't want to rush to any conclusions or judgment. But let me say this: one of the things that flashed on the television screen that just moved me to tears is that UNESCO, the United Nations agency, has already said we will help save and rebuild Notre Dame. Think of that the United Nations gets such a bad rap in many quarters in the United States. Within minutes, UNESCO announced to the world that once the fires have been put out and they can assess the damage and determine what it's going to take to rebuild it, that this agency will be one of the leads in helping France rebuild this. They will rebuild it. There's no chance they won't. They rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral in London after the war.
Very significant because the United Nations really was formed to help win the war, but now it has turned into a way for nations of the world to gather together. So it's very significant.
It's deeply
for
significant
them to make that statement. They're representing the world, really.
And it reminds you that it's not just about the Middle East and Palestine and Venezuela and the Security Council versus the General Assembly, that the United Nations does an enormous number of things that are not strictly political. Most of the attention comes for peacekeeping missions and the great debates in the Security Council and General Assembly. But this is a cultural agency that represents the entire world, and they had no hesitation saying, we will be there. We will be in the lead if you want our help. That just moves me so deeply. My daughter and I went to see the UN in New York not so long ago, and you just think of all that aspiration that it represented in 1946. And here's an example of what it does. UNESCO, one of its many arms, offering now to help rebuild Notre Dame. You can't look at this screen without being heartbroken. That this is, I can't remember anything in my lifetime.
Again, we're recording this program on April 15th, 2019, Tax Day. And we, in our What Would Jefferson Do segment, we talked to President Jefferson a bit about taxes. And then we had a lovely conversation with the head gardener at Monticello,
Miss Pat Brodowski.
Which you could talk to her for hours.
She's just so much fun.
And then we had a great conversation with Beau Wright. The
young idealist.
And we get email, and I tell you, I do read every piece of email that comes in.
We're going to get some on that conversation.
Well, we do. We get, there's a couple of people who have written as of late and taken you to task for saying things that they disagree with about our current president. And there's been even more people who have written in and said nice things about trying to keep things civil, and we do. But with Beau, really what I took away was that, he is, as you've termed him, a young idealist, but his intentions are good. You can disagree with him, but he's trying to do the right thing, and he's trying to represent the right thing.
Well, and his argument is that the reforms that his entity, Preserve Democracy, are suggesting are really nonpartisan reforms to create greater transparency in government, to make sure that that each agency of government has its own kind of sovereignty and is free from interference by the executive or Congress. So I really admire that. And I want to say something about criticism. So I got a letter yesterday from someone who was pretty unhappy with me about something I wrote about Donald Trump for this program. And I did the Jefferson. I wrote back and said, I have your letter. I very much appreciate it. I disagree here and here and here, but I'm glad I'm glad for your point of view. And then I said, would you explain further your view of what Trump has done to help restore the greatness of this country? I'd be very much interested in knowing. And then he wrote back a lovely reply. Mm-hmm. Jefferson is right. You do this. If you respond to snarkiness with artificial good humor or good humor.
I learned that from you, and it works.
It works because people calm down once they hear that someone's actually listening, not just sending a form letter saying blah, 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 thanks, or who are you? Once people realize that their point of view is valuable and taken seriously, even if you disagree with it, they invariably cheer up and say something generous. Yes. I've only had 2 or 3 exceptions to that in the whole course of my life.
There always will be, but it's back to, the luck of me being able to converse with President Jefferson, learning from him, learning from you.
Me getting to be married to him.
And he believes, I can't remember the quote, but I'm sure you can dial it up, but he believes in the goodness of people.
Oh, yes, the perfectibility
especially
of
an
man.
Educated population. I have learned that people in general who get into these snarky arguments, especially on social media, if you engage, people want to talk. They want to understand. They want a good outcome. There are those who do not, as you say.
Just remember from my last essay, the one that inspired Beau to write to us, that I said essentially that about half the country thinks that Barack Obama was the worst president in American history, and about half the country thinks Donald Trump is the worst president in American history, and they mean it. And you think, wow, that is a strong feeling. I don't feel that of either of them. I have concerns about both, but I don't think this hyperbolic, end-of-the-world, apocalyptic kind of language can't be doing any of us any good.
No, it certainly wouldn't be what Jefferson wanted, although he participated in that type of thing.
Well, he had Madison do a little of this, but Jefferson himself was gardening. He had his dibble. Had his dibble and his...
Oh, gardening. We probably should have started there and stayed there.
And his thimble. Uh-huh. Pat Brodowski is growing things. That's the most positive thing anyone can ever do. And did she say, 72 tomatoes?
And how many are you going to grow this year, tomatoes?
I'm going to do 50.
Well, that's kind of cutting it back, isn't it?
Well, I hate to admit this because it puts me in such a bad light, but if you did 5 and made them thrive, you'd have as many tomatoes if you do 50.
Maybe.
And treat them less well.
Maybe.
Well, last 2 years have not been great tomato years for me.
Oh, last year was great for me.
What's the great one that she grows? You've given me seeds from a tomato that was a Consuelo.
Oh, Castelluto Genovese.
Do you have any of those seeds?
I did not.
Pat, are you listening?
No, I have the seeds.
I need them.
But yes, I have some, and I will give them to you.
Please do, because
it's not too late to get them going.
I was out on Bainbridge Island off Seattle, and people were telling me about their tomatoes. And of course, they have wonderful growing conditions out there. And they were telling me about tomatoes that I must grow, and they gave me some seeds, and so I'm going to try those too.
It's a great place out there, Victory Seeds. I think they're in Washington.
Is that right?
Yeah. Remember Craig LaHoulier? He was on last year. We should follow up.
We should follow up because wasn't he the one who's trying to create the edible, sellable tomato?
No, that's Professor Paul Klee from the University of Florida.
And La Jolla was the one who does in the buckets.
La Jolla is famous. He's the guy.
He's the tomato man.
The tomato
The
book.
one you gave me a copy of.
And he did. He has a
grows them in
dwarf,
buckets.
a dwarf tomato project, and they're and anybody who's growing on a like
on your porch
deck
or on the deck or
in a pot. These are great for that.
Well, we should revisit that scene, but let's get these seeds going. It's getting close to Memorial Day.
Okay,
here.
well, it's time for us to go. It is the 15th. Our hearts go out to the French and
to the world for this loss. This is one of the greatest cultural losses of our time.
But where we started was Tax Day, and I believe you have something to say about that.
Yeah, let me change from sorrow to grumpiness here.
And with that, sir, it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thank you, David. I write this on April 15th, 2019, Tax Day in America. What a great trick it was back in 1943 when the Internal Revenue Service began withholding taxes from our paychecks. If we had to pay our entire tax bill on April 15th, there'd be trouble. Most of us wouldn't be able to write the check because we tend to spend everything we get in our paycheck and, of course, a little bit more. If we had to write the check on a single day, the tax default rate would skyrocket. Congress passed the Current Tax Payment Act in 1943 at the heart of World War II so that the federal government would get what it needs from us and we would feel it less because what's not in the bi-monthly paycheck is less missed than the whopper of a check you'd have to write on April 15th. Clever, but not very Jeffersonian. There used to be billboards in Montana that read, "Pay taxes on Election Day." You can see the wacky Western wisdom of that. If you voted on April 15th every 2 years, you'd be more likely to throw those high-spending rascals out and elect instead people who would do more to protect your paycheck. Jefferson would be in favor of that sagebrush reform, I think. He wanted us to resent taxes at the same time we understood that they are necessary to enable government to do the things government must do. He wanted a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution so that we'd have to write the check every year for our share of the entire federal budget. When government wanted to do something beyond the usual norm, say wage a war against Canada or Iraq, we'd each be called upon to write a fat supplemental check to the IRS, not only to prevent a national debt, but also to make us think hard before we loaded troops into transport ships. The modern American way of war is really no different from payday withholding. We can fight a $4 trillion war in Iraq, and the average American's tax bill does not go up. We just add the cost of the national debt and start lobbing cruise missiles. The fiscal conservatives rail against deficit spending, but it's not really about that from a Jeffersonian point of view. It's about fighting wars and keeping the people quiet at the same time. If our tax bill went up every time we invaded some country, even if our monthly withholding spiked upward, the American people would ask some very hard questions about what is a just and necessary war, and they would be very skeptical of any military adventurism anywhere in the world at any time. And that's precisely how Jefferson wanted it to be. He wanted the people to be in charge of their own destiny, not the gerontocracy in the United States Senate. But if, as a nation-state, you buy yourself an all-voluntary army and fight your wars without raising taxes, most people are merely going to shrug. That is precisely not how Jefferson wanted America to operate. I don't resent my tax bill. I just resent how it's spent. And my 2 senators and 1 congressman frankly don't give a damn what I think. They are friends to corporate welfare. If at the same time they can claim that they are taking care of the little guy, well, so much the better. But their key votes are made to make sure the wealthiest and most privileged, the ones mining the public lands and building the national security drones, are given a blank check both in terms of cash and freedom of action. I personally would be willing to spend more on taxes if that meant everyone had cradle-to-grave health care, Medicare for all, if we quintupled the appropriations for the national endowments for the humanities and the arts, if we made sure that everyone who wants a college education could get one, if we gave our national parks and monuments everything they need to protect what's left of the sublime in the American landscape, if we made a concerted national effort to lift the lives of Native Americans and help them knit their reservations back together, if we created a truly humane but firm border security system, etc. But I would not want to raise taxes unless every federal program were strictly means-tested, including Social Security. I know very well that if we raise taxes now, we just spend more on militarism and space wars, and our government, controlled by either party, would mostly redistribute upward toward the rich and the privileged. In other words, the problem is not the size of our tax burden, though that is surely worth examining, but the quality of our hearts and our understanding of the concept of distributive justice, first raised by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics in 350 BCE. I don't see how any fully formed rational person can oppose the concept of a guaranteed living wage for everyone who is willing to work hard in America. Robotics and artificial intelligence are going to force tens of millions of people out of work in the next half-century, and I can guarantee that each one of them is going to insist upon eating and wearing clothes. I certainly do not write my tax check to enable government cabinet officials to buy cones of silence, gazillion-dollar drapes and desks, to fly first class while they claim to be working on the people back in steerage, or to send their staffers out to buy their furniture or rent their apartments. I do not wish to send cabinet members' wives and husbands on European holidays thinly disguised as work trips. I don't want to pay the bill for my Secretary of the Interior to hobnob with mining and timber executives in Aspen, and I don't want my president charging me $3 million every time he goes to his resort at Mar-a-Lago, meanwhile personally pocketing a $200,000 initiation fee from every rich person who seeks to curry influence at that same resort. It's tax day. I'm supposed to be grumpy. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.